is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. The United States and the UK announced economic sanctions on Russian banks and people close to Vladimir Putin, including his two adult daughters.
Our other headlines: leave while you can. Civilians in Ukraine's southeast are warned to evacuate the area ahead of an expected Russian offensive.
Breaking ranks with the EU, Hungary says it will pay for Russian gas in rubles if Moscow demands it.
And a new chapter for London's book fair, open to visitors for the first time in 2 years, and Chinese authors are making an impact. The United States and the UK have announced fresh sanctions against Russian banks as well as those close to Vladimir Putin, including his two adult daughters. Both NATO and the European Union are also discussing further measures.
It comes a day after Ukraine's president told the United Nations Security Council that war crimes have been committed in his country. The EU has proposed a ban on Russian coal and is weighing up oil sanctions.
Well, NATO's Secretary-General warned there was no sign of a change in Moscow's position.
Regardless of when the war ends, this has long-term implications for our security, because we have seen the brutality, we have seen the willingness by President Putin to use military force to reach his objectives, and that has changed the security reality in Europe for many, many years.
Well, let's talk to Dan Ashby, watching events for us in Brussels. Dan, further economic sanctions, more banks and individuals within the Kremlin's inner circle targeted too.
Yes, significant new sanctions from the UK and US, as you say, targeting President Putin's two adult daughters, also the foreign minister's wife. And this is significant because the accusation is that Putin's wealth is being moved to his family members, but also that big one against Sberbank, the biggest bank in Russia. When I lived in Russia, you know, that's all over the high streets. That's a big bank being targeted at a time when the Russian economy is suffering. And then that ban on outward investment to Russia as well. In the UK's case alone, that's £11 billion. So significant new sanctions from the UK and US as the European Union debates its own sanctions. They have proposed a ban on imports of Russian coal. That would be stopping €4 billion worth of sales to purchases, rather, to President Putin. It was Germany, of course, who has put the brakes on a full ban on all Russian energy, including gas, because gas is the big one, Jamie. That's the one that the Europeans spend the most on. But so far, it looks like they're just going with coal, the $4 billion, along with other sanctions that they've got along with it. Of course, for President Zelensky, he's not happy. He said today that Western leaders are more worried about financial losses than war crimes. He wants to see a full ban on Russian gas, which would really strangle the Russian economy even more. And when he was talking today about his own country to the Irish Parliament, he emphasised how dire the situation is.
They also have blocked all of our seaports, together with the vessels that already had agricultural cargoes for export. And why are they doing this? Because for them, hunger is also a weapon against us, ordinary people, as an instrument of domination.
Dan, in addition to announcing further Russian sanctions, the United States has pledged another $100 million for Ukraine. What more support could be forthcoming from Europe?
Well, the big focus now with the NATO meeting coming up behind me is on arms. So far, Europe has supplied mostly light weaponry. The most successful example of that is the Javelin, the surface-to-air missiles, the air defence systems that have been so effective in shooting down Russian helicopters and Russian planes. And, of course, Europe's been supplying food and supplies, gear to Ukrainian troops. recently there's been reports of the Czech Republic going it alone and supplying tanks as well. So I think the focus now for the NATO meeting will be, is our NATO countries about to supply much more significant equipment to Ukraine as this conflict goes towards a more crucial stage where we're seeing a massing of Russian troops in the east. That's one part of the debate. The other part is about funding, because today the European Union acknowledged that it has only given Ukraine €1 billion when every day it gives President Putin effectively €1 billion for Russia's oil and gas. So the EU acknowledging that perhaps it needs to spend more too.
Just a further thought on the Czech Republic and Slovakia supplying tanks and support to Ukraine. Just how significant is that?
Yes, it certainly got ears pricked up today at NATO, because until now NATO's been careful to say it's supplying, I mean, it does supply some heavy weaponry in terms of those air defence systems, but mostly we're talking about those surface-to-air missiles, we're talking about bullets and supplies, and it's been really careful to lay off talking about planes and tanks. So the confirmation that the Czech Republic has sent those T-72 Soviet tanks and light armoured vehicles is a significant change, because they're obviously bigger attacking units that can be used to cause more loss of life and more damage. So a significant change. But I think the key thing is whether NATO is going to follow suit as a policy and whether more countries will do that.
Dan, thanks for that. Dan Ashby in Brussels.
The United Nations General Assembly will vote on Thursday on whether to suspend Russia from its Human Rights Council following accusations of civilian executions in Ukraine, something which Moscow has denied. Meanwhile, the Kremlin says it will pay its Eurobonds in rubles as long as its reserves remain blocked. Well, our correspondent Julia Chapman's in Moscow. And a reminder, new media laws in Russia severely restrict what can be reported there. Julia, let's talk first about sanctions. The EU appears to be holding off gas for now, which is that critical Russian export.
It is certainly, as Dan was saying, the asset that would put the most pressure on Russia, because a huge amount of its money comes from energy exports, particularly gas to Europe. But certainly we are seeing now a range of sanctions being introduced again against Russia to put more pressure on it and on its economy. So far, Russian officials have been quite dismissive of the effects of sanctions. The latest lines we've been hearing today from Vyacheslav Volodin, the Speaker of the lower house of Parliament, who said that the West's attempts to impose hellish sanctions on Russia have failed. The economy, he says, is holding up. He says they were trying to collapse the economy, paralyze the banking system, and that hasn't happened just yet. Certainly there have been signs that the economy is adapting to its new reality, but undoubtedly there are pressures and the cracks are beginning to show. The latest example being that Russia has announced that it is paying now its foreign debt in rubles. It tried to make a payment on Monday on its Eurobonds in dollars, in US dollars, but that was blocked by the recipient bank on the basis of sanctions. So Russia says it has now paid its debt in rubles and will continue to do so, although some say that effectively amounts to a default. The Kremlin insists that it has the resources to continue paying its foreign debt, but it says the West is trying to artificially push Russia towards a default.
That's the money side. Let's talk about that United Nations vote. They're set to decide on whether to suspend Russia from its Human Rights Council.
It would certainly be a very significant symbolic move, and it comes amid efforts from the United States and the United Kingdom to have Russia suspended from that council. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations calling Russia's membership in the council a farce, given the situation in Ukraine and the mandate of the Human Rights Council to protect and preserve human rights around the world. Russia has reacted quite strongly. The Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, saying that this would be unprecedented and unbelievable. And the Kremlin says that if the Russians are removed from the Human Rights Council, that would make the body less effective. But certainly it is a possibility. What needs to happen for this to become a reality tomorrow is for 2/3 of the UN General Assembly to vote in favor of it.
Julia Chapman in Moscow, thank you very much.
Well, as the international community increases sanctions on Russia, Prime Minister Viktor Orban says Hungary is ready to pay for gas in rubles if that's what Russia wants.
His latest shot across the bow at Brussels comes as he also takes aim at the Ukrainian government, with his foreign minister saying Kyiv is unfairly accusing Hungary of not doing enough to help it in the conflict. From Budapest, our correspondent Trent Murray.
Well, in a move that's likely to raise eyebrows across the European Union, Hungary's foreign ministry has summoned the Ukrainian ambassador, asking for a please explain over recent comments made by Kyiv. The diplomatic dressing down comes just days after Viktor Orban scored a landslide election victory in a campaign that was dominated by the conflict in Ukraine. Orban traded barbs with President Zelensky throughout the campaign, especially after the Ukrainian president called out Orban by name at a recent EU meeting, saying the Hungarian PM needed to, quote, decide who he was with, Moscow or Europe. That hasn't gone down well here. Claiming victory on Sunday night, Orban said he won despite opposition from a wide range of sources, including the international media, Brussels, and notably the Ukrainian president. And today, following this diplomatic meeting, Hungary's foreign minister said it was, quote, time for Ukrainian leaders to stop their insults directed at Hungary and acknowledge the will of the Hungarian people. Going on to say, quote, this is not our war, so we want to and will stay out of it. As the dust settles on the combative election campaign, Brussels has also taken aim at Orban, triggering official proceedings which could see EU funds frozen for the country. It all centres on a long-running dispute between the bloc and Budapest over rule of law concerns the EU Commission believes could be in breach of EU rules. The concerns centre on allegations that Viktor Orban has rolled back democratic freedoms here, as well as questioned judicial independence and directed taxpayer money to associates. Now, those are allegations he denies, but this move by Brussels shows they are ready to take on the newly elected leader. Trent Murray, CGTN, Budapest.
A man has died after crashing his car into the gates of the Russian embassy in Romania's capital, Bucharest. It's thought the driver set himself on fire. No one else was hurt in the incident. Several Russian embassies in Europe have been targeted in the last few weeks by protesters demonstrating against the invasion of Ukraine.
Sri Lanka's President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has said he will not resign in the face of protests against his handling of the country's worst economic crisis in decades. Demonstrations over shortages of fuel, food, medicines and power cuts began a month ago. Almost all cabinet ministers have resigned and opposition MPs have rejected his calls to form a national unity government.
Lawyers for Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan have been fighting an opposition attempt to oust him. Khan dissolved Parliament after the Deputy Speaker from his own party blocked a no-confidence vote. The opposition is challenging that decision in the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the country's president has asked the Electoral Commission to suggest dates for a new election.
BA has cancelled nearly 80 flights in the past 2 days as the British carrier struggles with COVID staff absences. It leaves thousands of holidaymakers' travel plans delayed or cancelled ahead of Easter. The airline had already said it would run a reduced service until the end of May. Staff shortages have also led to long delays at security and check-in at some airports.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, more Western sanctions on Russia. But what effect will they ultimately have on President Putin's invasion?
The British public not only need to know, but they want to know more about China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
East meets West. We're now at a time when we need the icebreaker spirit.
My first impression when I came to China is I noticed the similarities more than the differences.
It's about understanding each other's culture.
We look at the things that bring our nations together. My dad is Chinese, my mum is English. I grew up in London, but I went to China to work at age 25.
Whenever I've gone to China, it's just been amazingly welcoming.
The music is beautiful language and bring all the people together.
I'm exploring, I'm experimenting, I'm trying something new, all in the hopes to build a bridge. And I think we definitely need more people doing that.
It was only when I got to know my Chinese father in my 40s that I really got to know the other half of myself.
I hope we make it another 50 years, another 500 years.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dared to think beyond the horizon and to open up our world, on TV and online on CGTN.
I hope that you will all become icebreakers and bridge builders.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Now let's get more now on those sanctions that the United States and allies are imposing on Russia.
US Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a warning to Moscow after announcing the fresh round of sanctions against Russian banks and those closest to President Putin.
Our message to those who continue to enable the Russian regime through their criminal conduct is this: it does not matter how far you sail your yacht. It does not matter how well you conceal your assets. It does not matter how cleverly you write your malware or hide your online activity. The Justice Department will use every available tool to find you, disrupt your plots, and hold you accountable.
Our correspondent John Terrett is in New York. Good to see you, John. Now, what's the reaction to the new sanctions on Russia where you are?
Well, it's all over the news here. It's one of the key stories of the day, Juliet and Jamie, and we have some words from the administration themselves here saying that the sanctions will be sweeping sanctions that will imply significant costs to the Russian economy and further increase the Russian financial and technology isolation. And of course, as you know, Juliet, because we touched on this yesterday, it comes about 48 hours after the US Treasury stopped allowing Russia to access what's called the foreign currency reserves. They have about $600 billion worth, and they used to allow them to pay off sovereign bonds and debts with that money. That stopped on Monday, apparently. So this is further sanctions which were flagged up by Jake Sullivan, who is the head of the security division at the White House. So now it's on institutions and individuals backed by the G7 and the European Union. A couple of Russian banks in there, including Alpha Bank, I noticed. But most interestingly, and what's really causing a lot of interest here, two women called Maria and Katerina are being sanctioned. Now, who are Maria and Katerina? They are the adult daughters of Vladimir Putin. Now, I can tell you that any dad would do anything to help his daughters out if they were in a bit of a fix. So whether or not this is going to change Putin's mind on what's going on in Ukraine, who knows? But it's certainly part of the thinking going on here. And the reason they've gone after Maria and Katerina is because it is suspected that they might be harboring some of their father's assets. They're also going after the current and the former prime ministers and Sergei Lavrov, who is the technocrat foreign minister. His wife and his daughter are being targeted as well. Now, the truth is, Juliet and Jamie, as you know only too well, probably not much is going to change as a result of these sanctions being imposed. And the reason for that is that Europe is still buying billions of dollars in energy from Russia because I think it has to. Look at what the Germans are saying right now. Look at the notion yesterday put forward by the European Union to curtail coal supplies into Europe and the consternation that's caused among some member nations. But I will tell you this, here in North America, the pressure is really being ramped up now on ending all European imports of Russian energy, all of it. Now, that's an easy thing to say, you understand, but talk show after talk show after talk show now, they are talking about that as the next step because the number of sanction opportunities, of course, having implied so many of them, are beginning to run out. And just a quick bit of breaking news on this subject. Intel, the major chip maker based in Santa Clara, California, has just announced that it's going to sever all ties with Russia. They employ 1,200 people there. Juliet and Jamie.
Well, thanks for that breaking news. And look, you're talking about sanctions opportunities. And Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, she's been talking about even more sanctions and the impact that will have on the global economy.
Well, that's right. Janet Yellen is one of those people who the world listens to. You know, when she talks, they listen. And she's been giving evidence today to the House Financial Services Committee up on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And she said that what's happening in the Ukraine will have enormous repercussions for the global economy. She particularly cited the fact that it will have implications for the global flow of food and energy. And if you remember, Juliet, this is something that Volodymyr Zelensky touched on yesterday. I reported yesterday when he was speaking to the Security Council. Yellen said what's happening in Ukraine is brutal and unprovoked, will have promote economic vulnerabilities around the world and lead to higher debt burdens and limited policy actions for governments who will be affected, trying to recover as they are after COVID-19. I mean, the thing you have to remember is that she's also mentioned the word oligarch today. And just very quickly, Putin is propped up by three legs of a stool, as it were. One is the strongmen who surround him, who advise him on what's happening in Ukraine. The other is the technocrats, like the foreign minister. And the third is those oligarchs. And they are literally being pinned to the floor right now. They can't access their bank accounts, their houses, their yachts, their cars, nothing. And it's reported in London today that Roman Abramovich, who is in the process of trying to sell the Chelsea Football Club and real estate and hotel company, he's being allowed to do that. He's apparently going around asking people if they can lend him some money. So the reason for all this is the hope that they can put pressure on President Putin to stop this.
To stop those financial taps. Look, John, just quickly, the bond market has been tanking. Is this another inflation story?
Yeah, it is basically bond market tanking in the sense that, you know, the rates have been going up and the stock market, we're now in the middle of a huge sell-off here. And this is all because of a woman called Lael Brainard, who says inflation is much too high. Who is Lael Brainard? Well, she's a member of the FOMC committee at the Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. She's also tipped to be the vice chairman. She was dovish on the issue of raising interest rates. Well, now clearly she isn't. Wall Street now knows that inflation and higher interest rates are here to stay. And what they worry about, and the reason for the sell-off, is that the Federal Reserve will go on hiking interest rates and cause an recession, and that they may even try to cause a recession if that's what it takes to slow down the more than 40-year high inflation that we have at the moment. We'll know more because the Federal Reserve releases its minutes from the last meeting in just over an hour and a half from now. So we'll look at that very closely to see whether they are all on the page of hiking interest rates. In the meantime, the Dow is down by 250, the Nasdaq by 354. It's a big sell-off, folks.
Big sell-off. John Terrett in New York, thank you.
Well, the focus of the Ukraine war is turning to the southeast of the country after Russian troops withdrew from Kyiv and Chernihiv in the north. Authorities in Luhansk region have warned residents a new Moscow-backed offensive is on the way and urged them to leave through humanitarian corridors. The Associated Press correspondent Philip Crowther is in Lviv. Philip, what do we know about what's happening in Luhansk?
Well, Luhansk and Donetsk are those two regions from which the local governors have called on the people to evacuate as quickly as possible. Originally, the region of Kharkiv to the northeast of Ukraine, in the northeast of Ukraine, there'd also been a call from the governor there. That has since been rescinded. But this still does show the emergency that the east of Ukraine is in right now, and indeed has been in since 2014, because remember, there has been a war here in Ukraine for 8 years now between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists in the Donbass region, in Donetsk and Luhansk. And that is territory that the Russian military wants to take, and it wants to take more of it. And military experts around the world, the Ukrainian military itself and NATO as well, are seeing this pretty clearly, that there is going to be an attempt from Russia to take as much territory as possible in the east, possibly already in the coming days and weeks. And that is what Ukraine currently is preparing for. There have been clear warnings, announcements, in fact, from the Ukrainian armed forces that there is going to be a Russian offensive. But also there have been warnings from the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, that the Ukrainian forces will be outmanned, essentially, in terms of the troops themselves, but also in terms of the weapons that they have. So there you have the repeated calls for weapons shipments to come into Ukraine from NATO member countries, the United States, maybe more than anybody else, as quickly as possible.
President Zelensky said that the aftermath of the fighting in Mariupol is likely to be worse than anything seen so far.
Yeah, because now Ukraine knows what can happen in those places that are occupied by Russian forces by more than a month. We've now seen those pictures from Bucha, those alleged war crimes, as Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine clearly says it, and as most witnesses would also clearly call what happened in the likes of Bucha, but also other villages and towns and suburbs around Kiev, where Russian forces were for just over a month now. So the fear is that what might be discovered in Mariupol could be worse. That is a country that has been, that is a city rather, that has been under siege for weeks now, and the inhabitants have let that message come out that the situation there is the worst possible in Ukraine right now. The question, though, is still who is going to be able to see what happened in Mariupol, because Russian forces right now are deemed to be closer to taking control of that city in the southeast than Ukrainian forces are to having complete control over it. We only know what happened in Bucha because Ukrainian forces retook that area and because witnesses, including journalists, were able to see with their own eyes what actually happened there. Will that opportunity actually arise in Mariupol? That is one of the big questions. And that is one of the questions that the Ukrainian armed forces will want to respond to as quickly as possible and have complete control over that city. But the same problem for Ukraine remains that it had when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. It is outmanned by Russian forces. The Russian military is one of the strongest in the world. Ukraine was expected to lose rather quickly. That didn't happen in the end, and Ukraine will have to again defy those odds in the east of the country and specifically in Mariupol in the southeast. I should also mention that there are continued attempts to get civilians out of Mariupol. Over 100,000 are believed to be there still. But the International Red Cross saying today that it feels it is almost impossible to get people out. It has tried since Friday to get civilians out, but each time their convoys have been stopped from entering Mariupol. So that's bad news when the International Red Cross essentially says it seems impossible to get people out right now.
Philip, thank you for that. Philip Crowther from the Associated Press in Lviv. Ukraine's president says European business leaders are not moving quickly enough on Russian sanctions. Speaking ahead of an address to the Irish Parliament, Volodymyr Zelensky said some still appear to think war crimes are not as horrific as financial losses. So will the new US and EU sanctions on Russia go far enough? Vicky Price is from the Centre for Business and Economics Research in London.
Imports of coal are being banned from Russia. And in terms of oil, it's been pretty patchy. It's not so much the EU, but the UK is saying it's going to stop importing by the end of the year. And the US, of course, has also banned imports of Russian oil. So there hasn't been the movement in the big areas that would affect Russia particularly, which are gas, of course, and up to a point oil. Oil, of course, is very important for Russia overall because it brings in 4 times as much as gas, but in terms of export revenues. But gas is incredibly important for Europe, particularly for countries like Germany and Italy, which have become almost entirely dependent in terms of the gas imports from on Russia itself. And that's a serious, serious problem as to how they could possibly move forward if the impact on their own economies is going to be so significant, if they cut off themselves off, if you like, from Russian gas.
Well, that's critical in this, isn't it? Because it's one thing to punish Russia. It's quite another if that pain is inflicted on Europe's own economies. How costly could these new sanctions be for European economies, which are still trying to recover from the pandemic?
What we have seen so far isn't going to be fantastically costly, but of course the cost that's coming through is through prices, because both oil and gas prices have gone up very significantly and the consumer is struggling, and we have seen the cost of living rising anyway, even before the war in the Ukraine. So it has added to it. So there's no doubt that it is a cost already. But of course, the sanctions that have been imposed so far affect various banks that have been dealing particularly with the West, and some of those transactions cannot be done any longer because, of course, they've been banned from using the SWIFT payment system. But you've also seen increasingly bans on both imports of particular products from Russia and ban on exports, which are what the latest sanctions also have, of particular goods such as semiconductors, for example, and also transport equipment. So there is an increasing layer of sanctions being imposed almost weekly. And the question is it going to be enough? And is it going to make any serious difference in terms of the outcome of this war?
Well, let's ask you to answer your own question, in a sense. All these weeks into this war, are sanctions working, and will these sanctions stop Russia?
Well, what we know is, if you're looking at what's happening to the Russian economy, yes, of course, the ruble has increased again after a very substantial fall, but that's mainly because of capital controls that have been imposed and, of course, the higher price of oil and gas. But in reality, there is a very high inflation in Russia already, so there are impacts on the economy there. And also interest rates are had to be raised very significantly, in fact, more than doubling, in order to make sure that the ruble would be itself sort of helped. So there are issues too in terms of all these bans that are happening, vessels not being able to travel freely as they did before. And there are forecasts that the Russian economy may drop by possibly 10% in 2022. So there are obviously costs, plus, of course, the cost of the war itself. So we're not talking about all those sanctions and whatever is happening on the ground not having an impact on Russia. It is.
China has called the images coming from Bucha deeply disturbing, while warning against a rush to judgment before any official investigation.
Reports and images of civilian deaths in Bucha are deeply disturbing. The truth must be established. Humanitarian issues should not be politicized, and any accusations should be based on facts. Before the investigation concludes, all sides should remain restrained and avoid baseless accusations.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Greece on strike. How rising prices pit trades unions against the government in a national day of action.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Juliet Mann. Our top stories. The United States and the United Kingdom announced economic sanctions on Russian banks. and people close to President Putin, including his 2 adult daughters.
Leave while you can. Civilians in Ukraine's southeast are warned to evacuate the area ahead of an expected Russian offensive.
And breaking ranks with the EU, Hungary says it will pay for Russian gas in rubles if Moscow demands it.
Greece has been brought to a standstill in a strike as thousands of workers stage a 24-hour walkout over rising prices and falling incomes. Labour unions, representing 2.5 million public and private sector workers, called for a protest outside Parliament in Athens. Unions are demanding a 13% minimum wage rise to combat poverty and cope with energy price hikes. Our correspondent Evangelo Tsipsas is in Athens. Evangelo, Greeks still remember the crippling debt crisis. What can we expect from this strike?
Well, as you mentioned, thousands took part in the protest in the day-long nationwide strike that happened today here in Athens from workers to the 2 largest unions that have been saying that we're going through a deepening crisis which has been squeezing their pockets over the last decades. Now, Greece emerged from the decade-long financial crisis in 2018 only to be hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which brought its largest industry, which is tourism, to a standstill. And now we have the soaring energy prices from the sanctions against Russia for the war in Ukraine that has put a further strain in workers' pockets. I spoke to a lot of them yesterday and during the protest, and what they told me was that their life is becoming unaffordable. When not working, Konstantinos Iordanidis helps around the house. It's one of his daily routines since he moved in with his mother. He gets paid just over €1,000 per month, almost double the national average wage. But after living alone for almost 10 years, the high cost of energy, food, and rent meant he had to make a change.
I've been thinking of moving out again on my own, but I just can't. I was getting paid more a few years ago. Actually, it's the same. It's just that now everything has increased. I used to get paid close to €1,200, but rent, food, and energy all increased. It's difficult. For example, in Greece, €700 to €750 is considered a high salary. The national average is around €550 per month. With that money, you literally can't do anything. How can you live alone when the lowest rent in Athens is €300?
Businesses and households continue to face a massive wave of price increases, with the government struggling to reel them in. Authorities are subsidizing fuel even more than usual and have cut sales tax for businesses and students. But it's not enough, says Kostadina Dimakopoulou, a university student in Athens. She compares it to the decade-long financial crisis.
I feel that I have to cut expenses from everywhere. I remember during the financial crisis, the feeling in the household, how we had to cut expenses. It's the same feeling now. The only difference is that now I have to do it all for myself. I really don't know how, but I have to. Sometimes I do jobs here and there just to earn €40, enough to relieve my family from expenses. Those €40 help.
The surge in consumer prices was driven by the price of electricity, fuel, and especially gasoline. It has been the highest in 40 years. Here in Greece, electricity increased over 70%, with natural gas being over 78%, forcing Mitsotakis' governments to intervene.
We are announcing measures for the most vulnerable, but also the middle class. We have thought it through and will be subsidising an additional $2 billion with the hope to bring some relief to 3.2 million vulnerable citizens, but also households that make less than $32,000 a year. The measures apply to anyone who needs them. We also plan to boost with a grant those with low salaries and with low pensions.
Over 40% of Greece's energy comes from natural gas imports, making it particularly vulnerable to price hikes. The country is still paying debts dating from the 2008 financial crisis, so high inflation is one of the main obstacles to economic recovery. The Conservative government here in Greece has increased the minimum wage in January by 2%, taking the minimum wage monthly to 663 euros. Mitsotakis' government pledged that he will increase that starting May. But people here in Greece from the unions and workers are saying that those measures are just not enough, as they need at least a 13% increase to have a normal European life.
Evangelos Tsipsas, thank you very much for that.
Let's take you to France next, where the latest opinion polls show the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen closing in on Emmanuel Macron ahead of the country's presidential election. A poll for the newspaper Le Monde shows incumbent Macron has a predicted share of 26.5% of the vote. That's compared with 21.5% for the National Rally leader. French voters will cast their votes in what's likely to be a two-round election on the 10th of April. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Ryan Thompson, watching events for us in Paris. Ryan, this election's looking tighter than expected. What's going on?
Hi there, Jamie. Yeah, the gap between the two candidates is shrinking more and more. When we were looking at this same poll just about 2 weeks ago, there was nearly 10 percentage points between the incumbent president, Emmanuel Macron, and his second rival here, Marine Le Pen of the National Rally. Though it does seem to be that this boost that Emmanuel Macron saw for the month of March, largely built off his diplomatic efforts in resolving the situation in Ukraine, has peaked. Because now it seems, as we increasingly talk to voters, there is a concern about a decreasing amount of purchasing power and fears about inflation and stagflation in terms of salaries within the Eurozone. And Marine Le Pen has really made her platform play to this at a time when these voters are often in smaller parts of the country feeling forgotten. She is not doing these big meetings, these big assemblies in the big cities across France, but really taking time to have small meet and greets with voters across the country and make this a point that she will fight for them if she is elected to the Elysee.
And we saw energy prices skyrocket in France earlier this week. Is that going to play a part in the outcome of this election?
Well, Jamie, it is a growing problem for voters. If you had spoken to a majority of voters in early March, they would have said their paramount concern is security in Europe, given Russian aggression right on the border. But now it seems that increasingly these voters are worried about not having enough money in their pocketbook when it comes time to pay the bills. Because, of course, for many months now we have been talking about inflation as an issue Europe-wide. But within France specifically, we are seeing purchasing power by the average consumer shrink more and more. And there's, of course, a number of factors contributing to that. Food costs are going up, but also energy prices are at record highs. And we saw this on Monday when the price of electricity in France hit a number that we hadn't seen in many, many years. Actually, the amount per kilowatt hour between 8 and 9 a.m. was over 2,200 euros. This is an astronomical price, with the daily average coming down just a little bit shorter than that, 550. But really, Jamie, if you look at the big picture, because of course these are just numbers, these are prices that were unimaginable 1 year ago, even when people were staying at home, quarantining, following these COVID regulations. Now it is really an energy crunch that the nation is seeing, with even some of the biggest brands like Carrefour, the supermarket chain across France, saying that they are going to take drastic steps to cut their energy consumption, not just for them and their bottom line, but also at the request of France's power authorities, who are unable to put out that much power currently because 25 out of the 50 nuclear reactors in the country are currently offline.
Ryan, thanks for that. Ryan Thompson, our correspondent in Paris.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a new chapter, why this year's London Book Fair recommended reading are Chinese-themed children's tales.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here
Just gotta be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
Is the front line now after 9 days of fighting?
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front clear line. view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Now, it's a bad time to be a Russian musician or artist as the international community tightens economic sanctions after Moscow's invasion of Ukraine.
But in Russia itself, the show must go on. Concert halls and theatres seem to have been relatively unaffected so far. Our correspondent Lou Jushin reports.
This is a regular weekend show at the Moscow Musical Theatre. It stages only Russian musicals. The gate was crowded at the weekend and the venue was packed. Mikhail Shvydkoy is the artistic director of the Moscow Musical Theatre. He says it has not been seriously impacted by sanctions.
My idea, we must have a success in Moscow. I don't want, I not dream about the world tour. And a Russian language have enough good market too, because there's more than 200 million people, and from entertainment markets it's not bad. For me, enough.
That's not the case for some artists, theaters, and film studios that have close international cooperation. The Cannes Film Festival and the Eurovision Song Contest both excluded Russian delegations this spring. Several well-known Russian artists have been suspended or even fired, including soprano Anna Netrebko, famous Russian conductor Valery Gergiev, and young pianist Alexander Malofeev.
I was very astonished because usually we said that the culture over than politics. But in the one moment, the one gesture, everything destroyed.
Mr. Shvydkoy says the consequences of cultural sanctions are irreversible. However, he adds, now is a good time to get a new understanding of Russia's own arts. Liu Jiaxin, CGTN, Moscow.
Haitians in the United States are protesting against an immigration policy they describe as racially biased.
Some Haitians say restrictions unfairly target them, while opening the borders to thousands of Ukrainians fleeing conflict. Our correspondent Nitza Soledad Perez explains.
Haitians in the U.S. have staged several protests, pleading with the Biden administration to stop Title 42. That is the public policy enacted by the Trump White House during the height of the pandemic. It stops immigrants from crossing the U.S.-Mexico border to claim asylum, often turning them around and sending them back into poor conditions in Mexico.
We're pissed because they're deporting our sisters and brothers. This administration, despite all of its campaign promises, has deported close to 21,000 people during its tenure. 90% of those, close to 20,000, have been deported from mid-September until now.
Hundreds of migrants from Haiti have been landing in the Florida Keys in the past few weeks, and later repatriated by U.S. authorities to a country torn by gang violence, kidnappings, natural disasters, and political instability, after the president was assassinated last summer.
Haiti, 1 hour 45 minutes for the Florida. Now you have kidnapping, you have everything. People die, kill, people die. Joe Biden didn't tell nothing. He's killed the president, tell nothing. Why you put Haitian people down? Haitian people not deserve that.
The Biden administration says it will end the restrictions for asylum seekers in May of this year, according to published reports. U.S. officials are warning of a possible surge of 170,000 migrants across the border if Title 42 is lifted, and asylum seekers are allowed to stay in the U.S. while their claims are being processed. Meanwhile, the White House announced that up to 100,000 Ukrainians and others fleeing the conflict in Ukraine will be welcomed to the U.S. through its refugee program and other legal pathways.
We're just asking that the Biden administration stop racializing migration policies, border policies, and welcome the Haitian people, Haitian asylum seekers, as they should be.
We support the fact that this country, being a welcoming country, has opened its doors. You know, we saw President Biden with the Ukrainian baby. We understand that. But whether it's Ukraine, Afghanistan, Haiti, nations of Africa and Latin America, it has to be the same policy. It can't be, let's let the Ukrainians in, but when it comes to Haitians, I only have ice for you. This doesn't make sense.
For Haitians in the U.S., it's just another hard pill to swallow. Others are welcomed with open arms, Cubans, and now Ukrainians, while Haitian people are turned away despite decades of natural disasters and turmoil. Mitza Soledad Perez, CGTN, Miami.
Businesses around the world say that rail cargo from the EU to China is forecast to drop by half this year due to the invasion of Ukraine.
Many companies are avoiding transporting goods through the key transit route of Russia, but haven't found cost-effective rail alternatives. But industry leaders say they hope the situation will stabilise. Dan Ashby reports.
It's a critical cog in the engine of global trade, but rail freight is facing turbulent times. Many companies are now refusing to transit through Russia, and that has led to a drop-off in rail goods flowing from Europe to China, something freight operators are already seeing.
Yeah, it has a big impact on the total rail freight corridor between China and Europe. We were arriving 9 trains a week from those places in China towards the Netherlands, and it's now 50% of those volumes go to by rail now. So the rest is more shifted towards sea freighting.
Industry leaders forecast that overall rail freight cargo along the new Silk Roads will halve this year.
The transit route through Russia was the most reliable and quickest way to get goods to China, but the alternative route further south handles less than 20 times that capacity and is beset with inefficiencies and delays. In short, there's no quick and easy answer as to how to keep as many goods moving.
There are no EU sanctions directly stopping rail transit through Russia, so some hope the business imperative to get goods moving will override concerns about how they get there.
In terms of disruption, it is terrible, but of course the Chinese have no interest to stop. Europe has no interest to stop, so the trade must go on. People are looking for solutions. We are still hopeful that it will resume in the next weeks. The impression is that it went not completely down, but it was reduced, and we hope that in a few weeks it will come again on all the 3 corridors.
Rail freight handles only a tiny fraction of the trade between the EU and China, though it could be a major growth area in the years to come. In the meantime, the focus will be on just keeping the wheels turning. Dan Ashby, CGTN, Brussels.
It's one of the biggest events of Europe's literary calendar. The London Book Fair is back this year after the pandemic curtailed proceedings. Exhibitors from around the world are taking part, including China. Our correspondent Nuid Jabakal reports.
You see the rice field, and you see the village, and a fishing boat, and of course a dragon here.
In a corner of the London Book Fair, this children's book is hoping to bridge cultural divides. Xu Lin's grandpa tells the story of a young Chinese girl in Britain starting at a new school. She struggles to fit in until she brings her grandfather and his traditional artwork to class.
For me, it's very important because this book shows the diversity of the classroom, and also especially through the Chinese painting to break up the boundary of the language. So it's a cross-culture, and we try to understand each other, appreciate each other's background and culture.
The book's been shortlisted for the UK's longest-running children's book award, the Kate Greenaway Medal. Its publisher hopes it can spark interest in more books being translated in both directions. But experts think there's a delicate balance to be struck.
Some Chinese writers are trying to be international, and it could work, but then it loses its Chineseness. So again, it's a question of what is the most genuine story that is being written, and how does it work? Does it work differently in Chinese, or does it work differently in English?
More than 900 companies are attending this year's fair, including dozens from China.
It feels a bit strange walking through an event like this again, bustling with businesses and packed with people from all around the world. Because of the pandemic, this is the first London Book Fair since 2019, and with legal restrictions on COVID lifted here, it could serve as a test for other big events returning to the UK.
So we thought it was important to try and make sure that, in particular, our international audience felt that we were a safe event that they wanted to attend. So what we've done is we've kept the COVID status checks in place for all attendees. It's so important. Events like this are what London is all about.
For years, traditional publishing has faced growing pressure from the digital world. The visible focus here, though, is very much on physical books, and the deal struck could serve as a reminder of the appetite for print. Nawid Jabarkil, CGTN, London.
The headlines again. The United States and the UK announced economic sanctions on Russian banks and people close to President Putin, including his 2 adult daughters.
Our message to those who continue to enable the Russian regime through their criminal conduct is this. It does not matter how far you sail your yacht. It does not matter how well you conceal your assets. It does not matter how cleverly you write your malware or hide your online activity. The Justice Department will use every available tool to find you, disrupt your plots, and hold you accountable.
Our other headlines: leave while you can. Civilians in Ukraine's southeast are warned to evacuate the area ahead of an expected Russian offensive.
Breaking ranks with the EU. Hungary says it will pay for Russian gas in rubles if Moscow demands it.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com, the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.